Okay, so I'm on sabbatical, and which is why I'm here, or how I'm here. And I've been writing a book on tragedy, which is at present called Tragedy, and it's in 9 bits. And it's something that I've been failing to finish for years and years. It goes back to a long, long time. And I presented some of the arguments for it at EGS in 2011. I was teaching a class with Judith Butler at the New School, and I came to Susfe and laid out some of that stuff there. And then other things got in the way. And then, so I've gone back to it. And there were 2 big holes in the argument, or in the exposition, as well as the whole thing was completely badly organised. So I've been rewriting and then writing new pieces, a commentary on Plato and a commentary on Aristotle. How boring is that? You know, an pedestrian, agonizingly anal work on Greek philosophy. And so I'm presenting that to the class, and they've already, lost the will to live, and will continue to lose the will to live for the next 2 days when we go from Plato to the turgid predictability of Aristotle's poetics. But I'll try and make that. So that's the kind of wider picture. Now, what I'm going to present tonight is the part of the introduction to that book, which lays out some of the bigger themes. So, and I'll see how far I get, and I might speed up at a certain point. Not all of it needs to be said, and so I'm very happy to be in Malta, and it really is. It's been. I felt I've had an imaginative connection with this place for a long, long time, and I'm very happy to finally be here. And so, tragedy shows, the first part is called Feeding the Ancients with Our Own Blood. Tragedy shows what is perishable, what is fragile, what is slow-moving about us. In a world defined by relentless speed and the unending acceleration of information flows that cultivate amnesia and endless thirst for the short-term future, allegedly guaranteed through worship of the new prosthetic gods of technology, tragedy is a way of applying the emergency brake. Tragedy slows things down by confronting us with what we do not know about ourselves, an unknown force that unleashes violent effects on us on a daily, indeed minute-by-minute basis. Such is the sometimes terrifying presence of the past that we might seek to disavow, but which will have its victory in the end, if only in the form of our mortality. We might think we're through with the past, but the past isn't through with us. Through its sudden reversals of fortune and rageful recognition of the truth of our origins, tragedy permits us to come face to face with what we do not know about ourselves, but which makes those selves the things they are. Tragedy provokes what snags in our being, the snares and booby traps of the past that we blindly trip over in our relentless stumbling forward movement. This is what the ancients called fate, and it requires our complicity in order to come down on us. Yet the fruit of a consideration of tragedy is not a sense of life's hopelessness or moral resignation, as Schopenhauer thought, but I think a deepened sense of the self in its utter dependency on others. It is a question of the self's vulnerable exposure to apparently familiar and familial patterns of kinship, although it sometimes turns out like Oedipus that you don't know who your parents are. But if you do know who your parents are, you still don't know who they are. One of the most salient but enigmatic features of Greek tragedy is its constant negotiation with the other, especially the enemy other, the foreign other, the barbaric other. The oldest extant piece of theatre we possess, Aeschylus' The Persians from 472 BCE, depicts the defeated enemy not with triumph but with sympathy, with an anticipation of the possible humiliation that might face the Athenians should they repeat the same hubris as the Persians in desecrating the altars of the Greeks. Sadly, the Athenians did not heed Aeschylus's lesson, and the brief period of Athenian imperial hegemony in the central decades of the 5th century BCE ended in the humiliating defeat of the Peloponnesian Wars. There is perhaps a moral to be drawn for our time and place where the empire knows its heyday is over and we live in a constant state of war. The first rule of war is sympathy with the enemy. This is something that can be seen in the tragedy of Euripides, especially those that deal with the bloody end of the Trojan War in plays like The Trojan Women and Hecuba. As Aristotle put it perspicuously and somewhat blithely nearly a century after the zenith of Greek drama in the second half of the 5th century BCE, tragedy is the imitation of action, mimesis, praxios. But what exactly is meant by action? It is far from clear. In play after play of the three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, what we see are characters who are utterly disorientated by the situation in which they find themselves. They do not know how to act. We find human beings somehow compelled to follow a path of suffering that allows them to raise questions which admit of no easy answer. What will happen to me? How can I choose the right path of action? The overwhelming experience of tragedy is a disorientation expressed in one bewildered and frequently repeated question. I underlined this every time it came up in the 31 tragedies, and it comes up a lot. The question is, what shall I do? What shall I do? Tragedy is not about the metaphysical cultivation of the bios theoretikos, the contemplative life that's the supposed aim, fruit of philosophy in Aristotle's Ethics, or in Epicurus, or in the other Hellenistic schools. Nor is it about the cultivation of the life of the gods or divine life, or bios theos, which is also the constant promise of philosophy from Plato onwards, as I tried to talk about today in class. No, tragedy is thinking in action, thinking upon action for the sake of action, where the action takes place off stage and is often described to us indirectly through the character of a messenger. But this thinking takes the form of a radical questioning. How do I act? What shall I do? If tragedy is mimesis praxios, then it is action that is called into question through tragedy, divided and sliced open. What the experience of tragedy invites is neither the blind impulsiveness of action nor some retreat into a life of contemplation, but the difficulty and uncertainty of action in a world defined by ambiguity, where the right always seems to be on both sides. Hegel is right to insist that tragedy is the collision between opposed yet mutually opposed claims to what is right. But if both sides are right, then what on earth do we do? Part of the joy of wandering into the ancient world and dealing with seemingly remote phenomena like Attic tragedy is how little we know and how little we will ever know. One of the many things that we don't know about ancient tragedy, the most important and enigmatic, is some sense of what the spectator was expected to take away from these spectacles. The ancient Greek word for spectator was theoros, from which we get the word theory. Theoria is linked to the verb to see, theorein, which takes place in a theatre, a theatron, to name the act of spectating. If tragedy is the imitation of action, although the nature of action remains deeply enigmatic, then praxis is something seen from a theoretical perspective. Or better said, perhaps, the question of theory and practice, or the gap between theory and practice, first opens in theatre and as theatre. Theatre is always theoretical, and theory is a theatre, where we are spectators on a drama that unfolds, our drama. In theatre, human action, human praxis is called into question theoretically. Otherwise said, praxis is internally divided or questioned by theoria in the space of theatre, where the empty space of the theatre is a way of calling into question the spaces we inhabit and subverting the divisions that constitute social and political space. Now, aside from a fragment by the great sophist Goregas that I'll perhaps look at in a minute, and Goregas is one of the heroes of this project, and Aristophanes' The Frogs, where he stages a debate between Aeschylus and Euripides as to who is the best tragedian, that I discussed later in the book. The only spectator reports that we possess come from Plato and Aristotle, who had various axes to grind. In the case of Plato, it was a little like basing your view of the Vikings on the reports of the Christian monks whose monasteries they ransacked. Aristotle appears more benevolent, but appearances can be deceptive. Despite some wonderfully important historical and philological and archaeological work, we still have little idea how tragedy was seen and what the audience thought. We have no online reviews, no blogs, and no tweets. Nor do we even know for sure who attended the plays. For example, we cannot be certain whether any women attended the festivals where the tragedies were performed with such an abundance of female characters. But in my view, far from being a vice, this epistemic deficit, this lack of knowledge is, I think, a virtue. Tragedy for me is the life of skepticism, where skepticism is the index for a certain moral orientation in the world, an orientation that seems to emerge from the disorientation of not knowing what to do. I hope to make good on that as we move through. The book is a kind of... Anyway. In a lecture delivered in Oxford in 1908, Viliamovitz, Nietzsche's nemesis, who savaged, rightly, some of the questionable philological claims in The Birth of Tragedy, said, the tradition yields us only ruins. The more closely we test and examine them, the more clearly we see how ruinous they are. And as the ruins, no whole can be built. The tradition is dead. Our task is to revivify life that has passed away. We know that ghosts cannot speak until they have drunk blood, and the spirit that we evoke demands the blood of our hearts. We give it to them gladly. Of course, the irony here is that Nietzsche says the same thing, namely that it is our blood that makes the ancients speak to us. Without wanting to piggyback on the recent dizzying success of vampire fiction, the latter's portion of truth is that the ancients need a little of our blood, our true blood, in order to speak to us. When revived, we will notice that when the ancients speak, they do not merely tell us about themselves, they tell us about us. But who is that us that might still be claimed and compelled by these ancient texts, by these ruins? And here is the beauty and the strangeness of this thought. This us is not necessarily existent. It is us, but in some new way, some alien manner. It is us, but not as we've seen ourselves before, turned inside out and upside down. Another way of putting this is that the we that we find in tragedy is invitational. An invitation to visit another sense of who we are and who we might become. I borrow this thought from Bernard Williams's Shame and Necessity, which I discuss later in the book. The idea of invitation has been interestingly developed by Raymond Geuss in the eponymous final chapter of his world, A World Without Why, as a kind of procedure, if not a method. For Geuss, one is invited to look at two or more things placed in conjunction without necessarily asking why this is the case or seeking for a cause. That's the without why part. A pile of dead bodies in a ditch in Iraq is placed alongside the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom speaking oleaginously in the House of Commons. Here the idea of invitation can produce an unexpected juxtaposition or disjunction that provokes thinking. In my view, tragedy invites its audience to look at such disjunctions between two or more claims to truth, justice, or whatever, without immediately seeking a cause or sublating the phenomena into a higher unity. My concern in thinking about tragedy and what I call tragedy's philosophy is to extend an invitation to you to become part of a we that is summoned and called into question by ancient tragedy. More simply stated, every generation has to reinvent the classics. I think it's the responsibility of every generation to engage in this reinvention. And it's the very opposite of any and all kinds of cultural conservatism. If we don't accept this invitation, then we risk becoming even more stupefied by the present and the endless onrush of the future. The nice thing about that stupefaction is that it can be easily avoided by nothing more difficult than reading. And most of the plays are not even that long, which is one reason why I like reading plays. There are 31, it doesn't take that long. Indeed, although it might sound pompous, I see this as the responsibility of each generation to pass on something of the deep and unknown past in a way that will speak to the present and arrest us momentarily from the irresistible pull of the future. If the disavowal of the past through the endless production of the new is the very formula for ideology in our societies, then tragedy provides enduring resources for a critique of that ideology that might at least allow for the imagination of a different range of human possibilities. But first, however, we need to reach for the emergency brake. Second part is called Philosophy's Tragedy and the Dangerous Perhaps. Tragedy's philosophy is opposed to philosophy's tragedy. The thought here, which I made good on today in class on a commentary on Plato, is that philosophy as a discursive invention beginning with the Republic but extending along the millennia into the present is premised upon the exclusion of tragedy and the exclusion of a range of experiences that we can call tragic, particularly the emotions of grief and the phenomenon of lamentation, which is at the centre of so many tragedies from Aeschylus's Persians onwards. I want to suggest that this exclusion of tragedy is itself tragic, and this is arguably philosophy's tragedy. I want to defend tragedy against philosophy, or perhaps better said, that tragedy articulates a philosophical view that challenges the authority of philosophy by giving voice to what is contradictory about us, what is constricted about us, what is precarious about us, and what is limited about us. Philosophy, once again, beginning with Plato, appears to be committed to the idea and ideal of a non-contradictory psychic life. Tragedy does not share this commitment, and nor do I. Tragedy is about what Carson calls the hot bacon smell of pure contradiction. One of the axes that I'll be grinding in this book is a critique of the very idea of moral psychology. I hate moral psychology. And the attempted moralization of the psyche that is at work in philosophy and in much besides, especially, obviously, Christianity. Tragedy is what gives voice to what suffers in us and others, and how we might become cognizant of that suffering and work with that suffering, where suffering is that pathos that we undergo, where tragic passion is something undergone and partially overtaken in action. I want to emphasize the word partially. Agency in tragedy is ever partial. In reading tragedy, we might learn to appreciate both the precariousness of existence and what Judith Butler would call its grievability. At the source of tragedy is grief and the extreme passions of mourning and lamentation, for which there are many words in Attic Greek. It's this phenomenon of grief and lamentation, again, as we saw in class today, that Socrates wants to exclude from the education and life of the philosopher, and most importantly, from the philosophically well-ordered city, regime, or politeia described in Plato's Republic, which is at once psychic and political, and based on an intended analogy of the psychic and the political. The city and the soul are mirrors of each other. Philosophy on this view is a regime, a politeia, that imagines an intense regulation of affect, in particular the affect of grief in the construction of the soul. My larger story, that I only hint at here, developed in the class, is that tracks the exclusion of the tragic poets in books 2, 3 and 10 of the Republic, and questions the metaphysical and moral motivation for that exclusion. The mannered ferocity of Plato's denunciation of tragedy seems to conceal a deeper worry about the nature of the philosophical perspective that tragedy seems to embody and its relation to what is all too simplistically called sophistry. There's much to say here. So chapter 3 of the book is about sophistry. The supposed stability of the distinction between philosophy and sophistry is one of the things I want to press at in order to recover the persuasive force and power of a certain sophistry against the accusations of Socrates or against the reassertion of Platonism that one finds in contemporary philosophers like Alain Badiou. To put it crudely, tragedy's philosophy is sophistry. My general question could be stated in the following way. What if we took seriously the form of thinking that we find in tragedy and the experience of partial agency, limited autonomy, deep traumatic affect, agonistic conflict, gender confusion, political complexity, and moral ambiguity that it presents? How might that change the way we think and the way we think about thinking? Might that be tragedy's philosophy as an alternative to philosophy's tragedy? Might that be what Nietzsche meant when he described himself as the first tragic philosopher and called for philosophers of the dangerous perhaps? To put it a little obtusely, we might say that Nietzsche reads tragedy in order to defend a form of philosophy that is destroyed by philosophy. I want to destroy Nietzsche. I want to join Nietzsche in this defense of a tragic philosophy. And then I go through, I might skip this bit, I don't want to go on for too long. But it's very amusing. It's on Oedipus the king, and I go through a discussion of Oedipus and how Oedipus brings down fate upon himself. And just very, very broadly, the way in which characters in tragedy like Oedipus act and are acted upon. Right? And so what we see in characters like Oedipus is someone who acts rather manically, who begins from a position of knowledge. I'm Oedipus, you know who I am, all men call me great, to someone destroyed by that quest for knowledge, left ruined at the end, like all those heroes in Werner Herzog films. And Werner Herzog was just playing that plot out over and over again, powerfully. Anyway, I said a Werner Herzog moment recently. Again, I should get out more. So Oedipus, I think about fate is that we can think about fate as, there's necessity up there which we don't choose, and there's freedom down here, agency which we choose. What interests me in the structure of tragedy is the way in which fate, which takes the form of prophecy, is something that Oedipus calls down on himself, brings down on himself. So something unfree in the assertion of Oedipus's freedom, which leads to the destruction of his freedom. So the thought that's at the centre of tragedy, and the thought which is kind of obvious when you read the plays, but rebarbative to philosophy, is that at the centre of tragedy is the contradiction that we both know and don't know at the same time, and that knowing and not knowing at the same time leads to our destruction. And if there's if there's a moral, I don't know if, no, it's too late for morals. It's the wrong thing to say. I talk about another hero of the book. I'll go into this straight. Is Anne Carson. It's kind of Anne Carson against philosophy, broadly. And the Anne Carson, I could talk a little bit about her work. I'm sure you know it, and if you don't, you should. But her translations of Euripides are revelatory, and the prefaces that she writes to them are really brilliant. They appear in a book called Grief Lessons. She writes in Grief Lessons, why does tragedy exist? Because you're full of rage. Why are you full of rage? Because you're full of grief. This is absolutely right. Antigone rages because she's full of grief for her brother Polynices, who's refused burial rites by the leader of the city, Creon. Clytemnestra rages at Agamemnon because of her grief for her daughter Iphigenia, slaughtered like a young foal in order to ensure favourable winds in the sails of the Greek ships on their way to Troy. Hecuba rages at the murder of her daughter Polyxena, only to discover that all her other children had been killed as well. And Hecuba's grief seems to know no bounds. In the afterlife, she is told that she'll be turned into a dog. We might add a further question to Carson's list. If tragedy is the rage that follows from grief, then why is one full of grief? Because we're full of war and people have been killed. Tragedy might be defined as grief-stricken rage that flows from war. We live in a world whose frame is war, and where justice seems to be endlessly divided between claim and counterclaim, right and left, conservative, progressive, believer and non-believer, freedom fighter and terrorist, whatever. Each side believes unswervingly in the rightness of its position and the wrongness, or as is usually said, evil of the enemy. Such a belief legitimates violence, a destructive violence that unleashes counter-violence in return. We seem trapped in a cycle of bloody revenge and locked into vicious circles of grief and rage caused by war. Such is what seems to often pass for international politics in our world. This is where I think a reflection on Greek tragedy might at the very least illuminate our current predicament and tell us something about our present. The history of Greek tragedy is a history of war, from the war with the Persians in the early 5th century BCE to the Peloponnesian Wars that rumbled on to that century's end, from the emergence of Athenian imperial hegemony to its dissolution and humiliation at the hands of Sparta. In 472 BCE, Aeschylus' The Persians deals with the aftermath of the Battle of Salamis in 480. It was therefore a good deal closer to the Athenians than, say, 9/11 is to us. More than half of our surviving tragedies were composed after the outbreak of the Peloponnesian Wars in 431. Oedipus the King was first performed in 429, 2 years after the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, during a time of plague that's estimated to have killed 1/4 of the Athenian population. The plague that established the entire environment of Sophocles' play is not some idle musing, it was very real indeed. It killed Pericles, the leader of Athens, in the autumn of that year, 429. The frame of tragedy is war and its devastating effects on human life. Greek tragedy, particularly with its obsessive focus on the aftermath of the Trojan War, especially in the delightful excessiveness of Euripides, is largely about combat veterans, but it's also performed by combat veterans. And actors were not flimsy thespians who majored in performance studies with an abstract interest in social engagement. It's a bit much, isn't it? But soldiers who had seen combat. Tragedy was played before an audience that either participated directly in war or were indirectly implicated in war. All were traumatized by it and everyone felt its effects. War was the life of the city and its pride, as Pericles argued, but war was also the city's fall and undoing. Yet tragedy is a war story without a John Wayne figure, without a swaggering individualist who's the sole source of good in a world gone bad. On the contrary, in Greek tragedy, the hero is not the solution to the problem, but the problem itself. The hero is the source of the plague that is killing the city. This is one reason why Sophocles' tragedy is called Oedipus Tyrannos. The king is a tyrant who is polluting the city, and the only resolution to the drama is Oedipus' expulsion and exile. This is a great virtue, the realism of ancient tragedy, as opposed to the empty, idealized violence, vapid empathy, and hollow sentimentality of many contemporary war fictions. If tragedy is a drama performed by war veterans before an audience of veterans, then it pictures a world without heroes and without tyrannical leaders who delude and goad the people into making war. How might we respond to the contemporary situation of war? I might leave that for you to figure out. But one hero of the book is Raymond Williams, whose work is still very important. He writes a book in 1966 called Modern Tragedy. And he has this wonderful line, "To say peace when there is no peace is to say nothing." That's kind of what, to say peace when there is no peace is saying. To be a pacifist when there's no peace is just like breaking wind. Actually, it's a lot worse than breaking wind. The danger of easy pacifism is inert and self-regarding. So the question of war is uppermost. I'm skipping over a little bit because I want to push on. The book has a motto from Goregas, the Sicilian rhetorician who introduced much of the teaching of oratory to Athens in the latter 5th century, and who seems to have been directly influential even on the writing of tragedy, as in Helen's amazing speech in her defence in Euripides, the Trojan women. I talk about that later in the book, and I talk about Goregas at length. We possess an undated fragment preserved in Plutarch that gives us our earliest theoretical response to Attic tragedy. That is some sense of what the theros, the spectator, saw in the spectacle of tragedy. And Goregas writes, this is him, mouthed by Plutarch, Tragedy, by means of legends and emotions, creates a deception in which the deceiver is more honest than the non-deceiver, and the deceived is wiser than the non-deceived. The Greek word that's doing all the work in this passage is apate, which Liddell and Scott's Greek lexicon tells me means cheating, trickery, fraud, guile, deceit and cunning. It also connotes a stratagem in war. Altogether, it's a pretty bad thing. But consider the logic of the fragment. Tragedy is a deception or an act of fraud or trickery in which the deceiver is more honest than the non-deceiver and the deceived is wiser than the non-deceived. What Goregas seems to describe, perhaps even celebrate, is precisely what Socrates sees as the great danger of tragedy, the danger of deception, the power of persuasion to induce the affective effects of imitation, mimesis, which Socrates subjects to a corrosive metaphysical and moral critique in the Republic. The metaphysical critique concerns the nature of mimesis and its threefold remove from the world of forms. We talked about that today. The moral critique concerns the allegedly pernicious effects of excessive emotions, like lamentation in the case of tragedy and laughter in the case of comedy. This is how philosophy begins. People normally focus on the metaphysical critique of imitation. That's part of the story, but the moral critique of it is really important, and the emotion that is targeted for by Socrates is lamentation, because it creates a division within the self. By contrast, Goregas would appear to be suggesting that tragedy, and a fortiori all art, is the acquisition of wisdom through deception, through an emotionally psychotropic experience that generates powerful emotion. As Stephen Halliwell points out in a fascinating paper on the topic, Goregas' view would appear to be confirmed by a fragment from Timocles' lost play, Women Celebrating the Dionysia, which I would have loved to have seen. Here, tragedy is described as parasuke, an emotional consolation, cooling or coping with life's troubles, but also as a psychagogia, an enthralling persuasion, which can also denote a conjuring of souls from the netherworld. This is also, this term psychagogia, soul conjuring, is also the word that Aristotle interestingly uses in the Poetics. In other words, the wisdom of tragedy flows not just from deception, but from a kind of necromancy, the conjuring of ghostly illusion. Thinking once again of our oldest extant play, the Persians, the drama ends with the conjuring of the ghost of Darius the Great, who admonishes his son Xerxes before warning the Greeks not to engage in hubris. Tragedy is full of ghosts, ancient and modern, and the line separating the living from the dead is continually blurred. That means that in tragedy, the dead don't stay dead and the living are not fully alive. What tragedy renders unstable is the line that separates the living from the dead, enlivening the dead and deadening the living. Another reason why you could say it's a problem for philosophy or a problem for thought. I mean, one thing that one would like to know is who is alive and who is dead. Right? That might be a place to start. But what tragedy does again and again is to problematize that distinction. The dead are not dead and the living are not alive, because they're lived through by the dead who are not dead, who won't let them live. What kind of parasuke, what kind of emotional consolation does tragedy provide? Where is the consolation in all this hauntology? We might say that tragedy consoles through an imaginative enthrallment with an almost trance-like otherworldly state that is linked for Timocles and Aristotle and for us to pleasure, hedone. And that's the interesting thing. What's going on in this activity of tragedy and all these things I've talked about, and pleasure and the circuits of pleasure? As Horatio calls out to the ghost early in Hamlet, stay illusion. This, of course, raises the perplexing question as to the nature of tragic pleasure. What kind of hedonism is the pleasure we take in tragedy, which depicts not just suffering and death, but the ghastly porosity of the frontier separating the living from the dead? Is the greatest aesthetic pleasure the theatrically distanced experience of pain? And what exactly is the pleasure we take in spectacles of pain? I'd like to let those questions resonate awkwardly, thinking of Artaud's theatre of cruelty, Bataille's homely disgust, Hermann Nietzsche's blood orgies, the extremity of Sarah Kane's theatre, and perhaps the movies of Lars von Trier. What Plato sees as the great danger of tragedy is celebrated by Goregas as revealing the power of persuasion and the affective effects of imitation. For Socrates, tragedy and the other mimetic arts can lead us to have sympathy for morally suspect characters. For Socrates, it's an awful danger, the danger of deception and fiction, the danger of a vicious ordering of political life on the basis of a lie. And of course, as usual, Socrates has a point. We should never forget that the festival of the great Dionysia was first instituted around 532 BCE under the leadership of the apparently benevolent tyranny of Pisistratus and his growing political ambition. So there's a relationship that Plato identifies between theatre and tyranny, which is not accidental. Also, according to Plutarch, the famous lawgiver Solon left one of the first dramatic representations in disgust because he saw, like Rousseau a couple of millennia later, that theatre would lead to the degradation and sickness of the body politic. There's an implicit connection between democracy and theatre as public institutions of the city conspiring with each other to lead to tyranny. Right? So there's an interesting connection, the connection between democracy and theatre, and the connection of both to tyranny. It's one of the central arguments of Plato's Republic. What obsesses Socrates in the Republic is the question of tyranny and the link between democracy and theatre, where democracy, demokratia, is what Plato calls in the laws theatrokratia, a theatrical regime of power, what we might call a society of the spectacle, that will always leave the door open to tyranny. This is why, for Plato, the only true antidote to theatrokratia is philosophia. Only antidote to theatre power is philosophy. The vast question that Goregas' fragment raises is that of the necessity and indeed moral and political productivity of deception, of fiction, of fraud, of illusion. Does, as Nietzsche will suggest, our firstly Platonic and subsequently Christian will to truth blind us to the power of art in general and tragedy in particular? By contrast, can we assert with the young Nietzsche that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that the existence in the world is truly justified? Might the wisdom of tragedy, a deception where the deceived is wiser than the non-deceived, begin to emancipate us from the Platonic and Christian moralization at the core of truth? Is deception both the undoing of truth and the truth of truth? Such are some of the questions at stake in the relation between philosophy and tragedy. In tragedy's philosophy as riposte to philosophy's tragedy. And as perhaps can be seen, the stakes are pretty high, at least for me. Almost finished. Let's think about, this is called justice as conflict. It's an argument for polytheism. Let's think about Aeschylus's Oresteia, our one complete tragic trilogy, and possibly a unique example of one story being spread over three plays. What we witness in the bloodbath of the Agamemnon and the libation bearers, the Koiphoroi, is the history of violence upon which the apparently pacific political order rests. We see characters completely caught up in cycles of revenge, where there is seemingly no end to the violence and no end to its dogmatic justification by its perpetrators. Behold a masterpiece of justice, declares Clytemnestra as she exhibits in a macabre tableau the murdered corpses of her husband Agamemnon and his concubine Cassandra. Orestes claims justice as he slaughtered his mother, Clytemnestra. As Aeschylus says, the wheel turns. If justice is on both sides, then what exactly is justice? What the goddess Athena attempts in the final play in the trilogy, the Eumenides, is to use reasoning and persuasion in order to arrest the cycle of violence and find some way of stopping the bloodshed and finding a settlement. The first thing one notices is that in tragedy, justice is conflict. In a fight, it's a fight between opposed parties who are prepared to act violently in its name. The second thing one notices is that as a counterbalance to violence, there is the activity of what we might call, following Stuart Hampshire, adversary reasoning or adversarial reasoning in tragedy, where we think from the adversary's position and use reason in order to hear the other side. In tragedy, this adversarial reasoning takes place very often in a law court, as is the case in the humanities, or is staged as a legal dispute, as in the debate between Hecuba and Helen. Very often at the core of tragedy is the law, and we should not forget, obviously, that the law court is also a theatre and remains such to this day. Right? So another thing which interests me enormously is the relationship between tragedy, which is the content of which is myth broadly, and law, and the operations of law. In the Greeks, but of course also in Shakespeare, you could raise exactly the same series of questions, right, in relationship to Merchant of Venice or King Lear. Anyway, if one were optimistically inclined, one might see tragedy as providing an object lesson in resolving conflicts reasonably in a world of overwhelming enmity. I'm unsure whether I'm so optimistic because of what we also see in tragedy is the weakness of rational argumentation in the presence of violence. What I mean by that is that, for me, tragedy is not about myth. It's not, I'm against identifications of tragedy with myth, with ritual. I've got stuff to say about that. Tragedy is about reasoning. It's about argument, often legal argument. But there's a limit to what argument can do. Argumentation bumps up against this thing called violence. Right? There's a play called Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus, where there's a character on stage throughout the play, presumably, who doesn't speak, who's called violence. Right? There's a kind of mute presence of violence in tragedy which interests me. The philosophical belief, the belief that animates philosophy, is that reason can find out the core, can solve the problem of violence. Tragedy is doing something else. So you can find a situation where perfectly formed rational arguments are found against a certain position in tragedy, and yet they're not followed. Exactly the opposite happens. And that's making a point about the nature of rationality. I could talk about that in relation to the Trojan women, the dispute between Hecuba and Helen, which is an extraordinary piece of reasoning, where Hecuba wins the argument, but Menelaus still takes Helen back on his boat, and she gets to go home. To be found sometime later, although earlier in Homer's Odyssey, making a drink for Telemachus and Menelaus, in which she inserts some powder to help them relax, a little bit of kind of Mycenaean Xanax to keep things going. So Helen did just fine, you know. And she's a fascinating figure. Far too much ink has been spilt on Antigone and far too little on Helen. She's the much more interesting character for me. But that's by the by. Or indeed Hecuba. What is common to the optimistic and pessimistic interpretations of the use of reason, given that the opposition between optimism and pessimism is pretty questionable anyhow, in tragedy is the following, for me. Any strongly monolithic conception of reason, capital R, must be abandoned. We must accept that reasoning is always a two-sided process and a fragile negotiation in a world of constitutive and irreducible violence. This also means accepting that reason is essential, but essentially limited in its power, that it requires the use of rhetoric and persuasion, and that it can surely fail. What kind of reasonable settlement can enforce a bond in a conflict where there are passionate but utterly opposed claims to justice on both sides? Such is one of the questions that tragedy seeks to explore, and is arguably a description of the world that we inhabit and have always inhabited. What's preferable about the world of Greek tragedy is that it is a polytheistic world, with a diversity of conflicting and deeply flawed gods and rival conceptions of the good. It's my conviction, following Stuart Hampshire again, that the lesson of adversarial reasoning in tragedy is that it is prudent to abandon any notion of monotheism, whether that's either of the three Abrahamic monotheisms, a Platonic monotheism rooted in the metaphysical primacy of the good, or indeed the secular monotheism of liberal democracy and human rights that still circles around a weak, deistic conception of God. Tragedy's philosophy begins from the irreducible facticity of violence and the fragile necessity of reasoning in a world of conflictual force, a polytheistic world that continues to think of itself as monotheistic. If the acceptance of tragedy's philosophy entails the abandonment of modern theological shibboleths like a faith in progress, which is underpinned by a linear conception of time and history that tragedy twists out of joint, then it might also possess the virtue of a modest political realism that's begun where philosophy should begin, in my view, with disappointment. But although philosophy might begin in disappointment, it does not end there. On the contrary, disappointment is the graveyard of those philosophies and worldviews that insist manically upon affirmation, vitality, wonder, and creation. They're the real nihilists, the optimists. That's the kind of Nietzschean thought, right? Wonder, creation, vitality, emergence. I mean, please. Last bit's called tragedy as a dialectical mode of experience, very short. Is tragedy something that's available to us in the contemporary world? Far from claiming, like George Steiner, that tragedy is dead, I would argue with Raymond Williams that it offers the most powerful template for diagnosing the seemingly intractable conflicts that define the present and finding ethical resources for thinking beyond them. It's in this spirit, I think, that we could and should approach the struggles of our time. A tragic sensibility obliges us to see our implication within the conflicts of the present and our responsibility for them. If the present is defined by disaster, then tragedy shows our complicity with it. Say more about that. I mean, the first lesson of tragedy is obviously that the way tragedy is used as a term is not tragedy. If tragedy is tragedy on any kind of working definition, then tragedy entails our responsibility in a tragedy, right? So the way tragedy is used as something that befalls you, is something unpleasant, is, let's call it a misfortune, but it's not a tragedy. For something to be a tragedy, we are implicated and complicit with it, the way Oedipus is. The question of tragedy should not be confined to its existence or non-existence as a dramatic genre, which might or might not exist in the theatre. Rather, it's a mode of experience that can be found outside the theatre in film and TV, in politics, and most powerfully perhaps in our domestic lives, in our familial relations and kinship structures. Furthermore, tragedy is a dialectical mode of experience. Specifically, it's a mode of reversal, inversion, and negation where we're implicated at each step. Tragedy is an object lesson in dialectical thinking. It's a staging of dialectics, which is why Hegel, following on from his friend Hölderlin, had such a profound grasp of tragedy, even if he sometimes confined it, Hegel, within the horizon of reconciliation on the one hand and dissolution on the other. Perhaps tragedy is neither and both. What is perhaps new in my thinking with its focus on tragedy's philosophy is this dialectical turn. In opposition to forms of vapidly hopeful idealism which leads only to despair, I see tragedy's philosophy as offering a bracing sceptical realism that heavily qualifies what we might think of as hope, but perhaps also deepens it into a form of courage. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.